Muy buenos días, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a esta nueva actividad del Festival Puerto Ideas en Valparaíso, que este año celebra su 10º aniversario, gracias al apoyo de Colbún, Copeuch, Fundación Mar Adentro y por supuesto el Ministerio de las Culturas. Mi nombre es Daniel Halpern, me especializo en Ciencias de la Información y Comunicación. Y a continuación voy a tener una conversación demasiado entretenida, porque a mi lado, o en la ventanita que ustedes van a tener, está la periodista inglesa Kirsty Lang, de la BBC, tremenda periodista, tremenda profesional, con quien vamos a ver el impacto de los traditional media, como llaman los gringos, ¿verdad? Los medios tradicionales, el impacto que tienen en esta nueva verdad, en nuestra objetividad y también, por supuesto, en política. Y al otro lado está la socióloga española experta en comunicación y redes sociales, la doctora Sandra González-Bailón, quien va a conversar con nosotros sobre el poder de la información y el rol que tienen también las redes sociales en la actualidad. Tremenda actividad. Espero que la disfruten mucho, porque yo por lo menos así lo voy a hacer. Y bueno, vamos a conversar now. We're going to change our language from the Spanish to English. I'm sorry for my English. I'm also sorry for the Spanish because I made a lot of mistakes. But okay, this is what we have. So, Kirsty, today we have a really like strange phenomenon. It's the new media versus traditional media, and now the traditional media also has new media. So it's a very complicated environment. People can give whatever they want, like in terms of opinionation, in terms of what they want to say, and they like almost in the same place that journalists on the media. The power, where is the power? Where are the journalism? Where is the regular user? Today has a huge voice. Kirsty Lang, from BBC to the whole world, through Puerto Ideas, please.
Well, let me say, first of all, apologies that my Spanish is not good enough to speak to you in Spanish. And also, I so wish that I was in Chile with all of you. I was hoping to come last year, and then there were the riots. I was hoping to come this year. Now we've got coronavirus. But one day I will make it to Chile in person. I hope so. I want to begin with a little story because I think it's the kind of thing that's happening to all of us. The other day I had dinner with a friend of mine, a woman about my age, in her 50s, a mother, a grandmother, intelligent a woman. And we start talking about corona. And she says to me, even if there's a vaccination, I'm not going to have it. I asked her why. And then she went into, a kind of pretty crazy sort of sounding conspiracy theory about how vaccines could be used as a cover to inject us all with nanotechnology so that some secret group of financiers representing big tech and big pharma could control us. It sounded kind of crazy, but I didn't want to say that to her because she clearly felt very strongly. So I said, okay, where did you get this information? Facebook, she replied. So I said, okay, but what sources? She said, I don't know. What do you mean by sources? So I explained to her a reliable source would be the World Health Organization or the American Center for Disease Control, maybe a respected medical journal, or maybe something like the BBC or the New York Times, a trusted media organization who have the resources to employ fact checkers. She looks at me and she rolls her eyes. I don't have time for this. And anyway, why should I trust them? Now, I expect that people all over the world are having this conversation with their friends and family. And one of the reasons for this is that the media landscape in 2020 is unrecognizable to the one that I grew up in. And yet the regulatory landscape has not changed in my lifetime. So I left university in the mid-1980s. I joined the BBC. I was a trainee. We still train journalists. And it was a time when you could make a reasonable living as a journalist. I don't think that's increasingly, that's quite difficult these days. I spent 2 years learning my craft, local, regional news, then the national newsroom. And then eventually, after working for a couple of years as a news reporter, I became a foreign correspondent for the BBC. You know, I was taught to question things. I was taught that you couldn't release a story unless you had more than 2 sources. In those days, most people got their news from watching the television in the evening. In the UK, it was either the BBC or one of the 2 commercial channels, or, you know, maybe from buying a well-funded daily newspaper or weekly news magazine, again, where the journalists were well paid, they had time to investigate stories, double-check their sources. This is no longer the case. We live in an age where people expect to get their information for free, where the main source of news for many people, like my friend, are social networks, where information is unchecked, uncurated, unsourced. It's a world in which very few newspapers can afford to pay for decent journalism, a world in which young journalists get almost no training, they're badly paid, they often resort to rewriting press releases or writing features paid for by advertisers. We used to train up journalists on local newspapers. Many local papers and radio stations have gone bankrupt as advertising revenue dries up. So I think and what a lot of people don't understand, I think, is that gathering news, investigating matters of public interest, it costs money. Opinion costs nothing, but proper journalism costs money. Now, Britain is fortunate still to have the BBC, but we now face an existential threat in a polarized world, because an increasing proportion of the British public would rather get their information from a source, not that is balanced and says on the one hand, on the other. They want from a source that confirms their bias, whether they're from the left or the right. So we did a survey recently of our audiences, and we found that 1/3 thinks that we are left-wing, 1/3 thinks we are right-wing, and 1/3 said they didn't know, which I think means we've probably got the balance right. Let me just explain how the BBC is funded, because it's quite unique. It's a form of a levy. We call it a license fee, and it's paid by every household in the land. It's compulsory, and if you don't pay it, you get a fine. Now, this was introduced in the 1920s when radio was invented, because back in the 1920s, radio was new technology. It was the internet of the day, and it was considered too important to be left in the hands of the private sector or in the hands of the politicians. That was the view we came to in Britain. And that's why we set up the BBC and the license fee. And it means to that this day, the BBC is well funded. It pays its journalists to investigate and fact check. And also, very importantly, the government cannot interfere editorially. However, what we are finding at the BBC is that many people, young people, are leaving us. They're not using our services because they're choosing to stream YouTube or Netflix. And a lot of these young people are not paying the license fee, trying to find ways around it. So our audiences under 35 are dwindling, and this is an issue for us. There are also members of the current British government who don't believe in public service broadcasting. They think the BBC should be privatized, turned into a subscription channel like Netflix. In my view, this would be a disaster, not just for our democracy, but actually for the world. A couple of months ago, the Reuters Institute at Oxford University published their annual digital news report. And this looks at digital news consumption based on about 80,000 people all around the world in 40 different markets. And their conclusion was that the BBC was the most trusted news organization in the world. And what was really interesting for me was that it was the second most trusted news source in the United States. The most trusted news source for Americans is their local news station, then the BBC, and I think third was the Wall Street Journal, and after that, New York Times, and so on. Some of the most strongly distrusted news brands, Fox and CNN, are, however, the ones with the bigger audiences. And that's a dilemma for us journalists, because sometimes being accurate and balanced can be less dramatic. It can mean smaller audiences, because if you're dramatic and controversial, you get eyeballs. So I just want to go through a few things that we've done at the BBC as some actions to combat disinformation. So number one, create news that people trust. Number two, we have a specialist disinformation unit, which is dedicated to clearing up false stories. It's a fact-checking service. It's called Reality Check. People can send in stories that they want you to check. And in fact, these days, the Reality Check unit get a lot of conspiracy theories sent to them, which they then respond to. We have a specialist disinformation reporter called Mariana Spring, who, for instance, I saw her interviewing just yesterday a son whose mother believes in that coronavirus is a conspiracy. And he's asking us, how do I respond to my mother? What do I do? There's another example of a man who believes that there's a coronavirus conspiracy led by Bill Gates. So the Reality Check website put him in touch with a virologist, and we filmed them in conversation. We also have something called the BBC Monitoring Unit. This employs skilled linguists and journalists from all over the world. They monitor foreign media and social media in 100 languages. It's now run as a commercial enterprise, so it's a service that other organizations, governments, corporations, media can subscribe to. And this way you can track disinformation campaigns as they move across the world. The other thing the BBC is doing is media education, training young reporters, teaching them journalistic skills, distributing videos to schools, telling kids how you can spot fake news. And there's it's worth going to have a look at some of these videos. In Finland, media literacy is part of the national curriculum. All high school students are taught to identify false stories and make sense of which sources of information they can trust. And there is evidence to show that the Finns are less likely to believe in conspiracy theories. And there's just one more initiative I want to tell you about. 1 year ago, the BBC convened a meeting of major news organizations from across the world and big tech, so Google, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as New York Times, the Times, and so on. And we posed the question, how can we alert each other to dangerous false stories and stop them spreading? So we've been experimenting with this over the past year, and we have found a way so that we can put partners on guard at times of jeopardy. What do I mean by jeopardy? Well, when viral disinformation, risks real world harm. So a story that goes viral that could cause harm to life, or indeed a threat to the electoral process. So I'll give you an example. In April this year, a tweet was detected using the BBC Breaking News branding and logo. And this tweet said, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is dead. He had coronavirus at the time. This was untrue, obviously. The BBC immediately alerted all its partners in the news network. The tweet was brought down. And I think only one, as far as we know, one news outlet in Pakistan published and broadcast it. Had we not been successful, there was a real risk this story could have gone around the world, caused panic right in the middle of a lockdown. And of course, you could have had a big reaction on the financial market. So, it could have been very costly. But just finally, we cannot leave this issue up to news organizations and big tech to regulate themselves. Governments need to regulate, in my view. And I'll give you another example. In 2018, the German government passed new legislation forcing tech companies to remove hate speech from their sites within 24 hours, or they would have a huge fine. As a result of this law, I think 1 in 6 of Facebook's moderators now works in Germany, and they have tens of thousands of, I think, something like 30,000 moderators. So that is a practical evidence that legislation can work. So to conclude, the war against disinformation must be fought on many, many, many fronts. We must fund good journalism. We must educate our young people on how to source news stories. We must constantly rebut fake news, but we also need regulation. Big tech will only act, in my view, against disinformation when their bottom line is impacted. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty. Very nice ideas, very well argumented. So we are going to discuss afterwards. But before that, we have Sandra in the left or right side. I don't want to take any position about politics, so it depends where you are, okay? But so she's a professor in Annenberg, in the University of Pennsylvania. She has wrote some books about these ideas, how social media, the misinformation era, the digital social transformation that we are looking and observing. So Sandra, please, in 10 minutes, try to resume, to summarize. How is your research, how your research understand all this, the impact that social media is having on us, please.
Yes, thanks, Daniel. We'll try. And thanks, Kirsty. I lived for 10 years in England, and the BBC is definitely one of the things that I miss the most from my time then. So I'm going to use my short talk, as Daniel said, to summarize how I see social media shaping politics and exposure to information. And I'm going to use my talk to support the claim that online networks and social media in particular, but not only, carry both benefits and risks that are high stakes, that have high stakes consequences for how we think about politics and the quality of our democracies. Social networks can be tools for organization and awareness, and they can also be tools for disinformation and conflict. And paying attention to only one side of this equation, the good side or the bad side, simplifies greatly the debate we should be having about how these technologies impact society, and also, as Kirsty was saying, about how we think about regulation and regulating those technologies. Now, the sociologist in me always like to remind people that social networks and their benefits and risks predate the internet. Social networks, these ties that make us interdependent, have always acted as the hidden infrastructure of social life. They created channels for the flow of information, for mobilization, and for community building long before the internet was imaginable. Social networks have also always facilitated the spread of rumors, what sociologists call improvised news, as well as the spread of lies. And many of us have probably contributed in one way or another to spread some urban legend at some point in our lives. Now, what the internet changed and what online networks changed was the scale and the speed with which networks operate. In this social media era, information and lies travel faster and farther than they ever could in the past. One reason for this is that online networks allow us to gain exposure to content that we would not encounter otherwise. Another reason is that these networks are constantly pulsating with information, which means that there's not idle time for us anymore, right? Every spare moment, every working moment is filled with notifications, feeds, and social signals that our friends, acquaintances, but also total strangers keep on updating relentlessly. And I would like to point out here that when we talk about social media, we talk in fact about very different platforms with very different designs that encourage different types of interactions. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, WhatsApp, YouTube, or even LinkedIn, these are all creating different types of information ecosystems. They attract different audiences and they create different incentives to make those audiences stay online. And so essentially these different platforms are creating overlapping networks, and information often spills from one network to the next. So even if you're not, say, in TikTok, chances are that you will still see TikTok content when one of your friends reposts this on, say, Facebook. And the same spillover effects happen between social media and more traditional forms of media like newspapers or TV. And think about the use that a certain president makes of Twitter and how whatever happens on Twitter percolates and spills all over the news. Now, the one feature that characterizes online networks is that they are decentralized structures. And what this means is that no one is really in control of the content that is being created, posted, and shared. And it is this decentralized nature, the decentralized nature of these networks, what makes them so powerful, but also so dangerous, right? On the one hand, social media platforms have created a public domain in which long-standing gatekeeping roles lose prominence, and non-traditional media actors can suddenly start shaping the agenda, often increasing the public representation of voices that would otherwise be ignored. And the Black Lives Matter movement is a great example of this. And so it is for this reason that social media has been and still is so instrumental in launching social mobilizations, gaining traction in collective action efforts, and increasing the visibility of certain political issues. On the other hand, however, social media have also created an ecosystem in which information manipulation campaigns thrive, and automated accounts, bots, can rise to hijack communication streams. And so behind these efforts, There are a number of different motives. Often they happen for opportunistic reasons. For instance, to gain status or just to monetize public attention. But information manipulation campaigns are often also designed with malicious intent. So for instance, when this information is diffused to seed conflict or discord. And I'm going to stop here again for a minute to offer some definitions, because usually, at least in the research domain, when we talk about misinformation, this is like the broader category, we refer to claims that contradict or distort verifiable facts. And then there's a subset of what we call misinformation that is deliberately propagated. And this is what we call disinformation, which is meant to deceive. And then there is a smaller subset of content within the disinformation category, which is what we call fake news. And this is content that is designed to emulate legitimate news, but without the editorial norms and processes of news media that Kirsty was discussing before, ensuring the accuracy and credibility of the information. And so implicit in the definition of misinformation is that, strictly speaking, unverifiable claims cannot be classified as misinformation. Then there is the problem of identifying intent. In other words, the problem of identifying disinformation, right? And this is relevant because the interventions that we can put in place to prevent the spread of misinformation will not work to fight disinformation, right? Trying to improve digital media literacy, for instance, may make social media users more resistant to, say, share information coming from a dubious source. But this approach will not help us get rid of actors that are deliberately seeding online networks with content that is intended to manipulate. And then there is the issue of determining what the right unit of analysis is. Are we trying to identify sources of mis or disinformation, or just specific stories? And of course, the right answer is both, right, ideally. But when it comes to devising strategies to identify misinformation, often we are forced to focus on a limited set of stories that have been fact-checked. And we might be missing a lot of important, a huge fraction of all the information pollution that is out there. And remember that online networks are decentralized structures with an ever-evolving set of content creators. So this is really a moving target. Again, misinformation is not a new phenomenon, but what has changed is how it travels through the population, right? Before the internet, the media environment was characterized by broadcasting, mass media, and essentially common exposure to the same narrow set of sources. Cable TV started to fragment that environment, but it was the internet and the eruption of online networks that drastically morphed the structure and the composition of the media environment. There's three elements that, to my mind, are key to understanding how misinformation travels through our current media environment. The first, as I mentioned, is the way in which overlapping networks allow information to flow without pause. The second is the algorithmic curation of content, or how algorithms mediate exposure to information. And then the third is micro-targeting, or the segmentation of audiences in groups that will see messages tailored specifically for them. And at the heart of our interest of misinformation, really, there's the question of how exposure will lead to changes on opinion and behavior. This is the reason why we care about misinformation, right? Because we don't want that misleading information to have an impact on how people think or behave. And so, if exposure is driven by self-selection, meaning that people choose to read only sources that they already agree with, the fear is that these will reinforce or exacerbate polarization. If the content to which people are exposed is manipulated, say by Russian trolls, the fear is that this will exacerbate conflict. And if exposure to content is algorithmically determined, say via recommendations that are designed to keep users on the platform as long as possible, even if this is to the detriment of giving them quality content, then the fear is that this might lead to rabbit hole dynamics and radicalization. Now, the media and the public discourse often portray these exposure effect associations as a given, but the reality is, and I'm talking here with my researcher hat, the reality is that there are still many open questions on both sides of this equation. On the side of exposure, we really don't have that much data on the prevalence of misinformation via legitimate sources. We have some data suggesting that misinformation is in fact a tiny fraction of all the information circulating online, luckily. But we have very little data describing what is happening within the walled gardens of social media platforms. We also lack information on audience reach. So, how many people get exposed to misinformation? And related to these, and importantly, we also don't know if there are specific populations that are more likely to encounter misinformation because A, the networks in which they are embedded, and people choose their networks, B, the algorithms that curate content, or C, and most likely because a combination of the two things. On the side of effects, we also don't have much data on the impact that exposure to misinformation has on opinion or behavioral change. And this is really the key part of this equation, right? So it may very well be the case that online networks and algorithms are increasing exposure to misinformation and that they activate positive feedback and cumulative effects leading to rabbit hole dynamics, but we simply don't have the evidence to make any strong claims in this respect. Now, beyond the decentralized nature of these networks and the challenges of getting access to the data that would allow us to answer the still open questions, it is also true that there is a business model behind social media companies that relies on keeping users engaged. And the metrics of engagement on which these companies rely are blind to the actual content that is driving the engagement. In fact, those metrics might be making misinformation more likely to be floated by algorithms to the top of users' feeds. At the same time, we know that most online users are not spending their time looking for news and staying informed. Entertainment is way more popular than legitimate news. Silly videos receive more likes than stories of investigative journalism. And this is the content that the vast majority of the online population responds to. And it seems to me that if we are only paying attention to how social media mediates access to information, we are only paying attention to half of the story. And we should also acknowledge the agency that social media users bring to the problem, because at the end of the day, it is users who make choices. And those choices may be constrained by algorithms, but that they are not determined, right? And so those choices are not necessarily the best for how we think about democracies and our civic duty. So to wrap up, I started my talk by saying that online networks carry both benefits and risks. It is obvious that social media have created a series of challenges without precedents, especially in terms of how to curate information without constraining free speech and individual autonomy. In some narrow set of cases, it's very easy to separate truth from falsehood, but the reason why misinformation is such a complicated problem is that it is more often than not, it is very difficult to categorize content as true or false. And if you want to scale up techniques to identify misinformation and filter that out as we filter spam out of our inboxes, we have to find a way of classifying bits of information, and it is tricky. So how do we draw the line, right? Fact checkers can only do so much. There's too much information online to be able to be fact checked by humans. At the same time, and in many respects, as I said, social media have also created opportunities for marginalized voices to reach an audience and increase awareness in ways that in the past would have been atrophied by gatekeepers, including traditional media. And so this is definitely an important engine for social change that we shouldn't forget when we discuss misinformation. And I have many other things to say, but I'm going to stop here so that we can have a conversation.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for all your presentation, your conceptualization, the difference, right, between misinformation, this broad term, and then fake news. So let me start, before to make some questions like for you, to make some questions for myself and maybe for the audience. So imagine that we have the shape of the earth. We know, and maybe we're all wrong, okay? But according to all the images that has been taken from different years, from Russia, from US, from all the countries that who has been like in the moon, on the orbit, it shows that the earth is not flat. But there are many people who believe that the earth is flat. And if you go to their pages, meaning fans in I don't know, Facebook or in YouTube channels, and they discuss that the earth is flat. And I have a question, not for you, maybe for myself. Why do this Mr. Zuckerberg or all these other like big guys in all these social media networks don't say, I'm sorry, the earth is not flat? is a circle or close to a circle, right? It's not a circle.
Here.
Yes, thank you very much. But it's not flat. Yeah, maybe, yeah. It's not flat. That's the point. So why couldn't say that? The anti-vaccination movement, they may have some like stories where really like people get hurt from the vaccines, right? But it's not the 90% or 92, 95%. It might be 1.111 or 1.0001. Well, let's go to any other like issue. For example, in Chile, they have this huge idea that the cow milk is unhealthy. It makes like a very, very like bad for the people, that it's harmed people. So, but all these three areas at least, they had not been proved. On the contrary, research has shown that the earth is not flat, right? That the vaccines has finished with many of the disease that we used to have. And the milk from the cows, at least doesn't anything shows that it's unhealthy. For some people might be like not so good, but it's not unhealthy for most of the population. So my question, maybe it's not for you, it's for myself again, is why all these big guys, big organizations, huge companies that make a lot of money, because if the BBC would say something like that, not with these three topics, with another different ones, people will come and will say you have to close it because you are lying people. You're not a truth. You're not a truth media anymore. So we are going to to close, right? But why we have not seen anything related to that in the last 10 or 15 years? And again, why, for example, these social media platforms, to not mention anyone specific, who has shown many, like, I would say, crimes, like online crimes happening there at the same time. And then, like, it happens again and again and again. All these social media platforms have said many times they are fighting against misinformation. But we still have all these different fan page videos on YouTube that demonstrate that the earth is flat. So this is the first question for me. So it's not like it's a very relevant aspect, because you say, Sandra, at least mentioned many times, that the fake news or misinformation is not new, right? It's a huge. I mean, it's like we call in Spanish it's like the, how do you say, Sandra, hilo negro?
Black thread? No idea.
Yes, it's black red. It's like it's older than black red. It's a really old thing, of course.
Yeah. It's gossip, isn't it? We've always gossiped. I mean, even when we were our ancestors sitting around the campfire, we would sort of say, hey, have you heard? These two people are having an affair or whatever. I mean, even if we didn't know it was true. So that's human nature. But I mean, as Sandra said, it's now turbocharged by the internet. But I mean, I think there is an answer to your question, and I think the fact is that that algorithms used by social media favor controversial stories. The earth is flat is controversial. Vaccines don't work is controversial. Cow's milk is bad for you is controversial. So the algorithm favors that. It gets more hits, it gets more advertising. There is money in fake news and disinformation to be made. And I urge everybody to watch the excellent documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, which is about this very subject. And it is for that reason, I think that, we must regulate. We don't, I mean, the broadcast media and the traditional media is heavily regulated. We can't the BBC can't say the earth is flat, because the regulator would come down on us very hard. They'd say, no, you're not allowed to do that. You're going to be fined. We're going to take you off the air. But there's no regulation for Facebook or Google. If we suddenly put out far right Nazi, propaganda or whatever, we would be fined under hate speech legislation. But the social networks are not regulated, so they can get away with it. So I mean, I really do think that this is the key. But then we have this problem that they are companies based in the United States, but the audiences are global. So you need really big multilateral organizations like the EU, I think, to take them on. But that takes courage, and they do a lot of lobbying in Washington. So it will be interesting to see where this goes. But I feel, I don't know about you guys, I don't know what Sandra thinks, but I think there is a growing consensus really that regulation is the only way forward.
I have a question maybe for Sandra, who knows more. Is it possible to regulate? Because where do you regulate? They are in Chile, they are in US, in UK. There's a whole world. I mean, how do you regulate something? Because I can punish, right? Fine you, the BBC, where like in some specific country where you are. But when you are all over the place and you are like the whole world, it's also difficult. Sandra, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of legal reasons why they can't be regulated that really, to be honest, I wouldn't be able to know all but essentially these platforms are not media companies. That's the main reason why you can't apply the same rules. And they are making efforts at moderating content. And I agree with Kirsty that the way in which these platforms are designed, the affordances they offer, like the fact that they have these like buttons and that those metrics of engagement, like commenting or liking or resharing, will then feed on the ranking algorithms that determine which content is more visible than other. That's the feedback loop, right? That's what users respond, and users respond more to content that generates awe and surprise, and that's usually fake content, right? Because it's the exaggeration, it's a drama, and then because more people react to it, that triggers a feedback loop that will make the algorithms pick up that content and prioritize it, and there you go. That's where you have, and that's a choice, that's a design choice. And so if these companies offered a different set of affordances or made their algorithms reward different, if the optimizing parameters were different, right? If it wasn't about liking, if it was more about quality, the game would be different, right? And so I want to make clear that these companies are trying to moderate content, but there's also the issue of, and it's a very slippery slope of how much are you going to control what people talk about, right? These are not media companies, as I said before. The content bubbles up from below, and it's true that some actors are using this decentralized architecture to actually engineer information coordination campaigns that are not organic. They are not emerging from the bottom up in the same way than normal users are generating content from the bottom up. They have a purpose, right? And the purpose is to manipulate. They intend to target specific populations, and so that's a fact, right? But it's very difficult to moderate, without crossing the red line of censoring, right? How do you moderate without censoring people? And yeah, it's true that we all I cringe when I hear that there's people who think that that the Earth is flat. And it's unambiguously wrong, but I think correcting that is not a matter of regulating social media. It's a matter of providing education and allowing, education is still the most powerful transformative tool I can think of, and encouraging critical thinking. And sometimes I feel that we are a bit unfair with our demands on social media platforms, because we're asking them to do things that we as a society don't know how to do. And what do you do when Fox News also spreads totally fake? I mean, so it's not only social media that is disseminating false information, right?
So Sandra, let me ask you maybe from a different point of view. You are a researcher. You know how all these methods work, like in terms of academy. And you know that sometimes there are 100 papers that show something, but there is one that shows the opposite, because the context was different and was even though it wasn't approved by a peer review, right? It's real research, but you know that the context was absolutely different. And that was the reason why they discovered, or they showed something that was the opposite to what the mainstream say. So as a researcher, you have to understand that you have to give like maybe 1% or 2% of visibility because the whole research shows the opposite. But here you have like so weird. You have on the same level both opinions, and you know that something's not good with that, because that's not the way that the knowledge is formed, or is at least diffused. When you diffuse, like when you talk others about this knowledge. So that is education. Like people have to understand that, or that's come from like the social platforms that have to regulate. From where do we start?
Well, I think that's a very big question, and I think there's a component of the science of science communication, right? How do we, we researchers and scientists are very familiar with probabilistic ways of thinking, meaning, we work with probabilities, right? We have uncertainty, and so we know that some things are more likely than others. We know that if 90% of the evidence points in one direction and 10% of the evidence points in the other direction, we know how to weight in those those pieces, but we still, we don't deal with absolute certainties in research and science. It's always, it's the best available evidence. What is the best decision we can make with the available evidence, right? And sometimes the general public, but I would say like the media also sometimes, like we scientists are usually afraid of talking with journalists because they go after and they do a great job, most of the time, but it's always like this idea of capturing one headline, one like, a punchline, like the one message that is going to attract the attention of the readers, but we scientists feel like it's an exaggeration or it's stretching the evidence. And so again, like I don't think this is an issue with social media. I think, Daniel, what you were saying, what you were suggesting is, would social media companies need to make sure that the visibility that information attains online is proportionate to the actual evidence supporting that information. And in principle, I would agree with that. But the pandemic has demonstrated how sometimes, I said in my talk, if we define misinformation as claims that cannot be verified by facts, the implication of this definition is that sometimes we don't have facts to verify or falsify our claims. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we knew nothing about this virus. And so we were all like moving blindly and trying to make recommendations. Epidemiologists were trying to make recommendations on the basis of very little evidence, and they make mistakes, even though they are legitimate sources. And at first they thought that masks were necessary, and then they backtracked, and then everyone had to wear a mask. And this was information that was coming from institutions that we respect. But there was a lot of noise at the beginning because we didn't know enough. There wasn't enough evidence. And so even the institutions and the agents that are in charge of giving recommendations and informing the public on the basis of the best available evidence made mistakes, right? Because we didn't know enough. And so that's what makes misinformation so tricky. And that, sometimes it is very difficult. The examples you were giving, Daniel, seem pretty straightforward, but most of the time it is very difficult to really draw a line in terms of what's true and what's false. And therefore, I think there's more dangers than benefits in social media making a decision for us in those instances, right?
Mm.
That's a very good point. So, Kirsty, how do you, we are living like uncertainty times, right? We don't know really, like, even like with the pandemic, like we don't know whether the vaccine is going to come out. We don't know many things about even like the disease, the corona. So, how do you inform audiences when you don't know? How do you inform people when you really don't know?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think one of the things that we've learned during the pandemic is that, scientists have different opinions. I think in the past, the general public has learned about scientific breakthroughs, when the research has been done. Here, we're in unknown territory because we have a new virus. We're actually following the scientists in real time as they do their research into this virus. So we have as many different opinions as we do scientists often, and we have scientists disagreeing, which we're not used to seeing actually on our news media. We tend to only see scientific breakthroughs once they've happened, the research has been done. So I think part of our job as journalists is to help the public understand that. I mean, we've certainly seen a rise in the BBC in our audiences, people wanting to know. We have a program which is just devoted to statistics now. It sounds quite boring, but people quite like it. You know, what do these statistics mean? When the government says there is, you know, there are X number of infections per day, what does it mean? Breaking it down in ways that people can understand. So I think that's one of the ways that we can help. But I'd just say finally as well, it's really important to take what we might think of as conspiracy theories. It's very important to listen to those theories, because there's sometimes a little kernel of truth somewhere in there. Take them seriously. Don't dismiss people. Don't say their ideas is deplorable, because they will immediately become very defensive. So one of the things that we've tried to do on our reality check website at the BBC is seriously discuss some of these conspiracy theories, even if they sound crazy. Where did it maybe begin? Was there a kernel of truth in one of them? Why do people believe this? So it's you know, we have a lack of trust in our world, and we need to understand why we have this lack of trust.
So let me make a follow-up question about that one. I have been not in many countries, but I have followed like some of the newses in many countries, and it's like really amazing, because some countries have kept almost everything open, like in US, right? Like they have kept like almost like the regular or normal life they have to continue. In other countries, or UK, even UK, in some moments of time, in other countries have been just the opposite. In Argentina, for example, they have been like for 6 months unlocked, I don't know, in quarantine. And in other countries like Chile, for example, they have kept like these mixed models. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Okay, or even like in many European countries. But one of the most common things or denominators is the government always I mean, the people always blame the government for the situation. Doesn't matter whether they have like the locked model or the unlocked model or the mixed model. They blame the government. So how do you understand or explain this concept? Maybe I'm wrong and I couldn't get well like all this stuff, but what I have seen is that, why do you think that this is happening? Because people, I don't know, maybe they're like really angry with themselves and they don't have anyone to blame, so they have to blame someone, and the government is the solution for them, or there are other aspects. And with this last question, and then I'm going to ask you to close each one a few minutes, and then we have to continue. We have to go to work and many other things, right?
Sandra, do you want to answer first and then me? I don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of good reasons why people feel frustrated and angry, and the sense of disenfranchisement and hopelessness. And it's very difficult to give a generic answer to that question, because even though it seems like the feeling is universal, every country has a different story. In the case of Spain, for example, which is my country of origin, there's a lot of social conflicts that have been there for a long time. Some going back to the Civil War, and when economic circumstances are dire and people are suffering, all these passions come out, and it's also a country where the levels of trust in the media are pretty low in terms of how much people trust their news sources. And so I think we would need at least another hour to really go into the details as to why there's this generalized sense of disenfranchisement and like not trusting political institutions, and it's very dangerous. And I think we should, as Kirsty said, one first step is not to dismiss how people feel, like to hear the other side and to try to understand where that frustration is coming from. To take it back to the topic of this panel, where like social media could help really unite and build bridges as opposed to polarize, right? And so we go back to should we be rethinking, or should we encourage or put pressure on these companies to rethink how they facilitate social interaction, because the way in which those platforms are designed is increasing polarization and conflict or potential. So that's, I think that they play a part in terms of thinking of how to to find solutions to this situation. But obviously they are not the only player that we should, it's a very complicated problem with many ramifications, and social media is just a little piece in the puzzle.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in the very first instance, we're angry with our governments wherever we are, because they're the ones who are telling us what we can do. Can we go out? Can't we go out? I think we've also seen, quite interesting really, a resurgence of the state. We have a public health problem. You can't leave that up to the market. In the end, it's only a government that can deal with a public health crisis. So, the buck stops with them. But of course, I would not want to be a world leader or a health minister right now, because, the evidence is changing all the time. So they are in a very difficult situation. And I think the other thing that's happened is that COVID-19, wherever you are in the world, it is like an X-ray. It has exposed divisions in our society. You look at the hotspots in Britain, and it's like right now, it's like a poverty map, right? It might have started in rich areas where people traveled and so on, but now it's in poor areas, and also it's exposed the divisions about, if you're wealthy and you have a nice big house and a garden, lockdown's not too bad for you. But if you're sharing your 2 rooms with 10 family members, and you have to go out to work, and you don't have savings, then you're suffering a lot more. So all of these things have become much more acute, and there's a lot more understandable anger because of that. But like Sandra says, the only way through this, in the end, actually, I think, is for us to act globally. And I'm really hoping that going forward, we will see governments acting together against both the coronavirus, but also the spread of disinformation. Because we can only battle this, if all of us as humanity comes together.
Yes, I mean, for first time, maybe in the whole story of the humanity, the 7 billion people has been affected, like for the same thing, right? It's absolutely different, for example, for the First or Second World War, when the people in Europe, maybe in North America, but the other countries wasn't so hard for them. Today, doesn't matter where you are. The humanity, the people, because they're breathing the same air. And it's amazing, like how all of us, doesn't matter where you're in UK, US, Chile, Russia, you or China, you are affected by the same virus. So that shows that all of us at the end breathe the same air. And I think also this is a connection, what we look for. Let's close each other, please, 1 minute, and then we are going to be out here, okay? Sandra, please, Kirsty started now. Please, I'm going to ask you to finish first, and then Kirsty, and then bye-bye.
Yeah, so just to reiterate my message, that I think when we talk about social media platforms, we should keep in mind that there's 2 sides to this coin, right? Because the social media has really changed a lot of things for the better. It has allowed people to organize, to mobilize, to raise voices that we wouldn't hear otherwise. But at the same time, for the same reasons that these networks have allowed people to come together without formal structures of formal organizations and without, costs, at the same time, it has made it easier for malevolent actors to spread misinformation and launch information coordination campaigns to try to manipulate voters. And I think if we are to find a solution to this problem, we should keep in mind that there's also good aspects to how these technologies operate. And the conversation we should be having is not so much about let's destroy social media companies or regulate them to the point that they don't have any, that they lose the essence of what made them be so powerful in terms of helping people promote social change. But we should definitely try to think about ways of redesigning how these platforms operate so that they serve the common good as opposed to just private interests. And the other thing that I just wanted to say very quickly is, again, when we talk about these companies, usually we talk about them as if they were monolithic entities, like actors with like a unified brain. And in fact, they are very diverse internally. And I think that's very interesting as well to see how management on the one side and the data scientists on the other, sometimes they don't agree. And the data scientists are also working hard to change things from within. And this is something that I wish we echoed more in our representations of how these companies operate. I think there's a great opportunity right now to have a conversation on how we want these companies to operate so that we all benefit from them, and so that we can restrain the negative side, but keeping in mind that they're also facilitating lots of things that are good for society, for civil society, for social change, and for political engagement, and we shouldn't disregard those.
I would, my final message, I think, would be about taking personal responsibility for this disinformation. So next time a story pops up on your Facebook saying, coronavirus is an evil plot by whoever, I don't know, Bill Gates or whatever, maybe it actually looks reasonable. Before you press the button and like it or send it on to a family member or friend, just check it. Have a look. Who is this story coming from? Is it from a reputable institution? You can see some of the language. If it's a proper scientific document, it's not going to be using hysterical language. As human beings, we are attracted to stories that are counterintuitive. Like the Earth is flat, of course, because it's like, oh, but I know it isn't, or maybe it isn't. So of course we're attracted to that. But just take responsibility before you pass on a story. There are lots of ways of checking it, and we all need to become responsible in this way, and that will help stop the spread of dangerous rumors.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. So with this last message from Sandra and Kirsty, that we should keep this responsibility. Me despido. Y despido a todos y le agradezco a cada uno y cada una de ustedes por acompañarnos. Los invito a seguir disfrutando y reflexionando con las actividades de esta 10ª versión de Puerto Ideas acá en Valparaíso. Nos vemos en una próxima ocasión. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Kirsty and Sandra, again, for staying with us. Thank you. Bye.